In this story, a woman dragged from an empire's death pits becomes the last living hope of a sovereign, slowly losing his mind to an ancient curse. But the man who put her there and the man who saved her are connected by a problem, secret so terrible that when it finally surfaces, the entire empire will burn before dawn. Chapter 1. The Ashen pits smelled of old smoke and surrender. That was the thing nobody told you before they sent you there. Not the weight of the leg irons, not the 14-hour shifts breaking stone in the dark, not even the cold that lived permanently in your bones in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. It was the smell. The particular, pervasive smell of people who had stopped believing they were going to leave. Seren had been here for 8 months. She had decided, early on, not to smell like that. It was a small decision, and a largely futile one, but she had made it anyway. Because the alternative was surrendering to the version of herself that sat in the corner of her mind and whispered that she deserved this, that the brand on her collarbone had always known something she hadn't. 3 dark veins, starting just below her throat, spreading outward like frost on glass. The wraith touch, the village elder had called it, holding his lantern close to her skin, as though proximity to the mark might reveal some truth he hadn't yet extracted. It appears when the bond is broken wrong, he said. When the life goes out of a person whose soul was touching yours. When the one marked is the reason the life went out. Tobias had been dead for 3 months before the brand appeared. She had believed, for the first horrible weeks, that the elder was right. That something in her had reached through the bond she'd shared with her husband and taken something from him. Gentle, quiet Tobias, who fixed things with his hands and sang badly and made her feel, for the first time in her adult life, like the world was a manageable place. She had believed she'd done it without knowing. That the healer's gift she'd spent 12 years developing had turned inward and become something monstrous. 8 months of stone breaking had not resolved that question. It had only sharpened it. She was on the 3rd tier of the pit, carrying a slab slightly heavier than her capacity, when the guards came. She heard them before she saw them. The specific sound of boots that belonged to people who had not been sent to work, but to deliver. The other prisoners went still in that practiced, self-preserving way of people who had learned that stillness was a form of invisibility. Seren set the slab down carefully and turned. 3 guards in imperial livery, black and silver, the crest of the Varen Empire at their chests. Not prison guards, not the mottled gray she'd grown accustomed to. Imperial. The kind of men who answered to someone considerably above the pit warden. The one in front had a document. He looked at it, looked at her, looked at the brand visible above the collar of her work shirt, and said, Seren Dale, former field healer, Ironhold Regiment. Convicted. Wraith touch verdict. 8 months served. 9 days short of 8 months, she said. He blinked. You're counting. I'm a healer, she said. I count things. Professional habit. She looked at the document. What does that say? It says you're to be transferred. Immediately. By order of the sovereign. The pit went very quiet. Not gradually. Completely. As though every person in it had stopped breathing at the same moment. Even the older prisoners, who had learned to master the language of not reacting, could not suppress the quality of attention that the word sovereign produced. Seren looked at the document for a long time. Transferred where? She asked. Varendal, the guard said. The capital. She had not been to Varendal since the war, since the regiment and the field hospitals and the 7 months she'd spent trying to save people who were dying faster than she could reach them. She had not thought about Varendal in 8 months, the same way she had stopped thinking about anything that existed on the other side of the pit's stone walls. Because thinking about it produced a specific anguish she did not have the capacity to manage while also carrying stone slabs. I don't have anything to collect, she said. Whenever you're ready. The guard looked at her with the expression of someone who had expected this to be more complicated. Right, he said. This way. She walked out of the Ashen pits in the same clothes she'd arrived in, into the kind of late afternoon light that made the outside world look like something from a different story. She did not let herself feel anything about it until they were 3 miles down the road and she was fairly sure no one was watching. Then she pressed her fingers against the brand on her collarbone, breathed through the old familiar ache of it, and asked herself the question she had been pushing away for 8 months. Why would the sovereign of the Varen Empire want a condemned woman who stole life from the people she loved? She filed the question carefully and kept moving. Because the one thing 8 months in the Ashen pits had genuinely taught her was that the moment you stopped moving was the moment the walls started closing in. Chapter 2. The Imperial Palace at Verandal was called Ashcroft Keep, and it was the kind of building that made you feel both very small and very awake at the same time. 4 wings of black stone, towers at each corner, the whole structure set against a hillside as though it had grown there rather than been built. Seren had seen it once from a distance, years ago, on the march south to the front. She had thought it looked like a clenched fist. Up close, it looked more complicated than that. She was brought in through the south entrance. Not servants' corridors, which she had half expected, but a proper hallway with clean stone, high ceilings, and the soft sound of her footsteps absorbed by carpets too thick to echo. A woman was waiting at the bottom of the main stair. Commander Vesna was built like someone had assembled her from the most efficient possible components, and then given her a face designed to discourage questions. She was 40, perhaps, with shrapnel-white streaks in black hair she kept pulled back severely. She had the posture of a woman who had spent 20 years standing in places where posture was the only thing between order and catastrophe. She looked at Seren with the directness of someone who had already read everything available about her and was now simply confirming it against the original. You look worse than the file suggested, Vesna said. The file was written before 8 months in the pits, Seren said. That tends to affect one's complexion. Something moved in Vesna's expression. Brief. Not quite a smile. Good. He needs someone who answers like that. She started moving and made it clear, without looking back, that Seren was to follow. You'll be given rooms, proper clothing, a meal. Examination begins at dawn. Questions? Approximately 40, Seren said, following. Starting with why a sovereign requires examination. The sovereign will explain his terms in the morning. What I'll tell you now is this. Your record from the Ironhold Regiment was reviewed in full before this transfer was arranged. Your healer classification is the highest field rating the Army has given anyone in 20 years. That rating is the only reason you're walking on carpet instead of stone. Vesna stopped at a door and opened it. Your rooms. The room was not a cell. Seren stood in the doorway long enough that Vesna noticed. You're checking for the lock, Vesna said. Professional habit, Seren said, completing her inspection without guilt. No lock on the outside. A window with actual glass. A fire already burning, which meant someone had known when she would arrive. And on the writing table, a stack of healer's texts. Old ones, annotated in 2 different sets of handwriting, the spines worn in the places where they'd been held open repeatedly. She crossed to the table before she'd consciously decided to move and opened the top volume. The annotations in the margins were dense. Questions, corrections, cross-references to other texts. One handwriting was careful and academic. The other was impatient, pressing into the margins to chase the edges of things rather than settle what was already known. The impatient handwriting belonged to someone who was afraid of something specific and looking for an answer they hadn't found yet. In the morning, Vesna said from the doorway, and pulled the door shut. Seren stood in the firelight with the books and the window and the specific quality of a room prepared for someone expected rather than dumped, and understood with the careful precision she applied to all diagnostics that she had not been brought here as a prisoner. She had been brought as a solution. The question was still what the problem was. She stayed awake reading far later than she intended, following the impatient handwriting through 3 volumes. It led her, finally, to a passage in the 3rd book. Old text, predating the Empire's current naming conventions, describing a condition called the Unraveling. She read the passage twice. Then she sat very still in the chair by the dying fire and thought about what it would mean to be a man of absolute power who was slowly losing the architecture of himself and could not afford to let anyone see it clearly. She thought about this until the coals went gray and the room went cold. Then she went to bed and did not sleep. Chapter 3. The sovereign of the Varen Empire did not receive her in a throne room. Seren had expected a throne room, some declaration of hierarchy, some architectural statement about the distance between their positions. Instead, Vesna led her to a war room at the heart of the keep's east wing, a long space dominated by a table so covered in maps and dispatch reports that the wood was barely visible, with windows set high to bring light without compromising the walls. He was already there when she arrived. Standing at the far end of the table with his back to her, hands braced on the wood, studying a map of the Eastern Territories with the focused intensity of a man who was angry at the information in front of him and managing it by sheer will. He was taller than she expected. That was the first thing she noted. The second was that his hands, when he turned to face her, were wrong. Not dramatically wrong. Not in the way that announced itself across a room. In the way a healer noticed. The faint gray threading his veins at the wrist, barely visible in the morning light, spreading in the branching pattern of something that was not natural deterioration. His movements carried a fraction of a second more deliberateness than they should. Not slowness, but the quality of a man who had learned to plan each movement because he could not fully trust the gap between intention and action. Caius Varen, sovereign of the Varen Empire, was 35 years old and looked like a man engaged in a quiet war against his own body, that the body was winning. His face gave nothing. Dark eyes, the sharp geometry of a face that had lost the softness of youth some years ago and hadn't missed it. A scar along the jaw from what had clearly been a field injury, badly timed if not badly treated. He looked at her the way she had looked at the texts the night before, not to assess her as a person, but to find the specific thing he needed. "You're a field healer," he said. 12 years, the highest field classification given in 2 decades. "I'm aware of my own record," she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise. Something closer to attention. The particular attention of a man who has been managing too many people who speak carefully around him and has just encountered someone who won't. "Do you know what the Unraveling is?" he asked. She had been awake most of the night, specifically so she could answer this question honestly. "It's a curse," she said. "Ancient bloodcraft. It works by severing the connection between a person and their own continuous self. Not memory. That's a common misunderstanding. The memories remain. But the experience of having them, the sense that you are the person who made them, that erodes." She paused. "It manifests physically through the vascular system. The gray in the veins is the signature. It progresses from the heart outward. At the terminal stage, the host loses the ability to direct their own will. They become someone who performs the movements of living without anyone home to direct them." He held very still. "I found the books," she said. "The ones in my room. I read the annotations." "And yet you're still here," he said. "You didn't wake the guards and demand to be returned to the pits rather than face a cursed man." "The pits are considerably worse," she said. "And curses aren't contagious. The body I'm concerned about is yours, not mine." She crossed to the table and looked at his hands. "How long?" He was quiet for a moment. The weight of someone who has not been asked this question directly in a long time. "The first signs appeared 3 years ago," he said. "I lose time. Not consistently. Sometimes hours, sometimes minutes. I wake in places I don't remember choosing." A pause that carried everything he wasn't saying. 3 of my generals have noticed something is wrong. I have managed the appearance of function, but the condition is accelerating. "How much time do you have?" He looked at her with eyes that were entirely steady and entirely tired underneath the steadiness. "My physician believes I have 4 months before the degradation becomes ungovernable." A beat. "My court sorcerer believes he has found a way to reverse it. It requires a specific kind of healer." There it was. Seren looked at the brand on her collarbone, visible above the neckline of the fresh clothing she'd been given, and said, "The Wraith Touch." "The Wraith Touch, as it is commonly understood," said a voice from behind her, "is a misidentification." She turned. In the doorway stood a man she had not heard enter, which was itself information worth filing. He was perhaps 60, slight, with the soft hands of someone who worked with manuscripts and symbols rather than weapons. His eyes were kind, warm, even, the warmth of a man who had spent decades being the most trustworthy person in whatever room he occupied. He wore the robes of a high sorcerer, the silver insignia of the imperial court at his collar. "High Sorcerer Aldric Morn," Caius said. "My chief advisor, and the man responsible for identifying you." Aldric stepped into the room with the unhurried ease of someone entirely comfortable in spaces that belonged to other people. He smiled at Seren. A genuine smile, she noted, or an excellent replica of one. "The mark on your collarbone is called the Wraith Touch by people who read the 3rd edition of Callum's Marks of the Blood. Those of us with access to the 1st edition know it by its correct name." He looked at her brand with the attention of someone who has been looking for it for a very long time. "It's the anchor mark, and it is the most extraordinary thing I have seen in 40 years of practice." "The anchor mark," Seren said. "The Wraith Touch interpretation arises from a translation error that has gone uncorrected for 150 years, Aldric said, settling into a chair with comfortable authority. "The mark does not steal life from those in proximity. It does the opposite. It identifies a person with the innate capacity to draw a curse out of a living host and hold it externally. Suspended, contained, long enough for the curse to be severed at its root." He looked at her with those warm eyes. "You, Serendale, are the only person in the known world who can unmoor the Unraveling from the Sovereign's blood." The war room was very quiet. The brand on Seren's collarbone did something she hadn't felt in 8 months. A faint, low warmth, like a coal stirred back to life. She pressed her heel against it and kept her face still. "And Tobias?" she said. Her voice came out steadier than she'd expected. "My husband. He died." Aldric's expression shifted into something that looked, with every measure she knew how to apply, exactly like grief. "Whatever happened to your husband was not caused by your mark," he said gently. "The anchor mark has never, in any documented case, harmed its bearer's loved ones. The interpretation you were given was wrong." She looked at him. She looked at the Sovereign. She looked at the brand on her collarbone, and 8 months of stone carrying and Tobias's face in his last weeks, when he'd been so tired all the time, so inexplicably and terribly tired. She kept all of that contained in a very small space, and said, carefully, "What exactly would this require of me?" Chapter 4. They gave her a proper workroom. Not a study, not a consultation chamber. A workroom, with a stone table and proper instrument storage and access to the palace's supply rooms. She spent the first 3 days in the archives, following Aldric's notes through the older texts, finding where his research confirmed what she read, and where it slid sideways in ways she couldn't yet articulate. She treated the Sovereign on the 4th day. The examination was clinical. It had to be. There was no other framework for two people who were barely acquainted to engage in something that required, at minimum, her hands on his wrists, his throat, and the site at the center of his chest where the unraveling had its deepest root. He submitted to it with the patience of someone who understood that dignity in this context was not served by resistance. She worked with the efficiency of a healer who had spent 12 years treating patients who couldn't afford her to slow down. What she found was worse than the texts had suggested. Not worse in scope, worse in age. The unraveling was not 3 years old. The gray threading his veins had the slight opacity that came with a curse that had calcified, sitting long enough to become part of the body's landscape. This was closer to 5 years, perhaps 5.5, which meant it had been placed before any of his generals had noticed anything wrong. Before he had noticed anything wrong. Which meant it had been placed when he was, by all accounts, fully functional and unguarded. She noted this and moved on, because noting things without enough context to interpret them served nobody. "You have a tell," the Sovereign said, somewhere in the 2nd hour. She looked up from his left wrist. "I beg your pardon?" "When you find something that concerns you, your jaw tightens. The left side only. You've done it 4 times. She considered denying it and decided the effort was beneath her. "Your condition is more advanced than the timeline suggested," she said. "I'm adjusting my assessment. Can you still?" "I don't know yet," she said. "I'll know more after I've finished." She returned to his wrist. "How long ago did the time loss begin?" 3 years. "And before the time loss, did you have any period of unusual fatigue, difficulty focusing that you attributed to stress or overwork?" A pause. 18 months before the time loss, he said. "I thought it was the Eastern campaign." "It wasn't," she said. She kept working. "I'll need full access to everything Sorcerer Morn has compiled on the Unraveling. His research and mine have some points of divergence I want to understand." "He'll be available. I'd rather review the material myself first," she said. "I find that reading someone else's conclusions before I've formed my own tends to pull my thinking toward theirs in ways that aren't always useful." He was quiet for a moment. Then, in a tone she couldn't quite categorize, "That is an extraordinarily rare quality in this court." She didn't answer. She kept working. She was aware of him the way she was always aware of patients. Their breathing, the specific quality of their stillness, whether they were managing pain or simply present. She was also aware of him in another way that she identified and firmly set aside, because it was neither professional nor useful. He began appearing in the archive 2 days later. Not announcing himself, not requesting permission. Simply present, working at the far table with dispatch documents, and the focused quiet of a man who had not stopped doing his work while also being slowly erased. He didn't speak immediately when he came. He read. She read. The archive filled with the sound of 2 people occupying a space without either of them making it a decision. He asked her, on the 3rd evening, what she had been reading in the Ironhold libraries before the war. Field trauma texts, she told him. Nerve repair. The intersection of blood loss and healing craft in patients whose bodies were doing too many emergency things at once. He told her, unprompted, that the Eastern campaign had lasted 14 months and cost the Empire 3,000 men in its first 6 alone, due to a tactical error made by a general he had subsequently removed. He said this with the flatness of a man who had looked at his own record long enough to stop flinching. "Were you responsible for the error?" she asked. "I trusted the man's judgment over my own assessment of the terrain," he said. That is its own kind of error. It's a very human one, she said. I'm aware. He turned back to his documents. Then, after a moment, did your husband know you were a better healer than anyone around you? The question landed like cold water. She looked up. He was still reading, but the quality of his attention had shifted. It was pointed at her, through the page. Yes, she said carefully. He thought it was extraordinary. He couldn't understand why I didn't find it extraordinary too. Why didn't you? She thought about this honestly, because I could always see what I hadn't yet managed to fix. He looked up then, and something in the way he looked at her, direct and quiet, carrying the weight of a man who has just heard something that resonates somewhere personal, made her look back at the text she was holding and reread the same sentence 4 times without absorbing a word of it. He came back the next evening, and the next, and the one after that. Each time a little earlier, each time staying a little later, each time asking one question she hadn't expected and answering one she hadn't asked. Something was building between them. Slow and inevitable, the way a season builds before it breaks. Not sudden, not dramatic, just the quiet, steady pressure of 2 people moving in the same direction without deciding to. She managed it by focusing on her work. She was good at focusing on her work. She was becoming less good at it by the day. Chapter 5. He collapsed on the 22nd day. Vesna found him in the east corridor at the 3rd hour of the morning, on his knees against the wall with his hands pressed flat to the stone. Not unconscious, but close to somewhere else. His eyes were open and entirely absent, as though the person who normally occupied them had stepped out and left the lights on. She didn't call the palace physician, which told Seren everything she needed to know about how much the commander trusted the official channels. She called Seren instead. The corridor was cold when Seren arrived. He was still on the floor, which he would not forgive himself for later, but which at this moment was the only honest assessment of his capacity. She knelt beside him without ceremony, put her hands on either side of his face, and looked at his eyes. She felt the unraveling pressing outward through his skin like something impatient. Caius, she said, using his name for the first time since she'd arrived. Partly because it was the fastest shorthand, and partly because she had a theory that familiar stimuli worked as anchors when the unraveling pulled a person toward the gray edge of themselves. His eyes came back. Slowly, then all at once. The sudden reassembly of a person returning from somewhere they couldn't describe. I'm here, he said immediately, in the automatic way of someone who had learned to announce their own presence to themselves. I know, she said. She kept her hands on his face. She could feel the unraveling signature against her palms. Not dangerous to her, but perceptible, the way a very cold surface is perceptible before it becomes painful. The anchor mark on her collarbone pulsed warm. She noted this in the professional part of her mind, and continued the note in the part she was still pretending she wasn't using. Help me up, he said. Not yet. She pressed 2 fingers to the pulse point at his jaw and counted. Elevated, irregular, slowing now. How long was the episode? I don't know. I don't know when it started. That's new, she said. Yes. The word was stripped of everything except honesty. The kind of honesty that doesn't have any performance left in it. It's been getting worse for the last 10 days. I didn't. He stopped. You didn't tell me, she said. I didn't want to tell you. Because you were hoping it would stabilize on its own, or because you were hoping I wouldn't find out before you'd managed to look functional again. A long pause. The second one, he said, with the specific exhaustion of a person who has just lost the energy to be anything other than exactly accurate. She sat back on her heels and looked at him. The corridor was dim, the wall sconces low, and in this light, the gray in his veins was visible, even without touching him. Faint threads reaching from his wrist toward his collar, from his collar toward his jaw. 5 years of a curse eating through him. 3 of those years he'd spent running an empire, commanding armies, making decisions that affected millions of people, while quietly waking up in rooms he didn't choose. She understood something, looking at him in that dim corridor, that her clinical assessment had not fully captured. He was not just dying. He was terrified of losing himself, the physical death he could face. She had watched enough soldiers make their peace with that particular reality. This was different. This was the specific terror of a person who had spent their entire adult life defined by their precision, their control, their capacity to know exactly what they were doing and why. Watching that certainty dissolve piece by piece into something no amount of will could reconstruct. "Tell me," she said quietly. "All of it. Every episode you haven't mentioned," he told her. It took a long time, because he was thorough and because she asked questions that required thorough answers. By the time he'd finished, the corridor had lightened toward gray dawn, and Vesna had silently supplied 2 cups of something hot and retreated to a discreet distance. "The unraveling was placed earlier than we believed," Seren said. "Before you knew. Before you could have protected yourself against it. Whoever did this had access to you during a period when you trusted your immediate circle completely." He was very still. "The gray at your wrist." She touched the point she meant. A cluster of veins that didn't follow the natural branching pattern, converging toward a single origin point she'd identified on the 3rd day. "This is where the anchor sits, not at the heart. That's where the decay presents most strongly, but the anchor itself is here. Someone held your wrist." She paused. "Someone who held your wrist long enough to make it look like a gesture of care." She watched him work through the implications. Watched the controlled surface of him stay controlled while something beneath it shifted. Not dramatically, but with the internal quality of a structure rearranging itself around new information it hadn't been built to hold. "I need to show you something," he said, after a long moment. He stood, steadier than he should have been capable of, which was entirely characteristic, and led her not back to the war room but down a staircase she hadn't seen before, into the lower archive. What he showed her made everything she thought she understood rearrange itself entirely. Chapter 6. The lower archive was older than the rest of the keep. Older than the Empire, possibly. The stonework predated imperial construction methods, built by people whose names had been absorbed into the foundation along with their effort. Torches rather than lanterns. Shelves carved directly from the rock. At the center of the room, sealed in a glass case that had been opened recently, sat a set of manuscripts so old their covers had calcified into the texture of bark. The disturbed dust around the case made the timeline obvious. "Aldric found these 6 months ago," Caius said. "He brought them to me as the source of his research into the anchor mark. He told me they described both the unraveling and the means of reversing it." Seren crossed to the case without touching it, and read through the open manuscript from where she stood. The text was dense with notation in the formal script of scholars who had lived centuries ago. She read it twice, then she straightened. "Caius, this text does not describe the anchor mark as a reversal mechanism for the unraveling." He turned to look at her. "It describes the anchor mark as a limiter," she said. "A person with the mark can slow the unraveling's progression. Arrest it, possibly, if contact is sustained, but not reverse it." She kept her voice level. "The reversal mechanism described in this text is a separate process entirely. One that requires the original caster of the unraveling to dissolve the anchor deliberately." She looked at him. "Aldric told you I could cure you." "Yes. He was wrong," she said. "Or he knew the text said something different and told you otherwise." The silence that followed was the kind that arrives when a conclusion presents itself before anyone has voiced it. sitting in the room between them, obvious and terrible and waiting. Why would he do that? Caius said. Not defensively. He asked it the way he asked everything, as a genuine inquiry into the mechanics of a situation he needed to understand. I don't know yet, she said, but I want to look at something before I speculate. She turned to the shelves. What else is in these archives that Aldric has accessed? Show me what you're looking for, he said. I'll pull the sections. They worked through what remained of the night. Seren directed and Caius moved, pulling volumes and holding torches while she read. Neither of them spoke much, because speaking would have taken attention away from the reading, and the reading was urgent in a way they both felt, but neither articulated. She found it buried in the third section of the restricted shelves, a folded document she almost missed, tucked into the gap between two volumes, not shelved, placed. Hidden, possibly, by someone who couldn't bring themselves to destroy it, but couldn't afford to have it found. Here, she said. Caius held the torch close. It was a receipt. Old paper, faded ink, but legible. A purchase record from an apothecary in the merchant district, dated 5 years and 4 months ago. The item purchased was a compound she recognized because she had spent the first month of her imprisonment in the Ashen pits reviewing every substance she'd ever worked with, trying to determine what could have produced Tobias's final symptoms. She knew that compound. She had been going over it in her mind for 8 months. It was not a poison, exactly. It was subtler than that. Introduced slowly over weeks into the food of a person in otherwise good health, it produced a gradual, convincing deterioration. The kind that presented as internal failure. The kind that would have looked, to anyone examining the body afterward, exactly like natural death. The kind that, if a healer had been in the same house, and the healer carried a mark already associated with draining life from loved ones, would have looked very much like the mark being accurate. The receipt was made out to a buyer she didn't recognize. But in the corner, in ink that was different from the documents, added later in a precise notational style as though someone were annotating a record for their own reference, were 2 initials. A.M. She set the document down on the floor between them and looked at Caius. When she was done explaining, he said nothing for a long time. She had learned, over 6 weeks in his company, that he thought best without being interrupted. That the silence was not absence but its own form of work. Then he said, very quietly, he placed the unraveling in me. And then he placed the evidence of your husband's murder in an archive he had recently been accessing. He stopped. He led us here. Yes? She said. He wanted us to find this. I think he wanted you to find it, she said. With me. Together. I think. She stopped, because the next part was hard to say aloud. Not because it was complicated, but because it was personal in a way that made clinical language inadequate. I think he is planning something that requires us to be exactly where we are right now. The torch flickered. Somewhere far above them, the keep was coming awake for the morning. Boots on stone, the distant sound of the yard. I'm going to find him, Caius said. Not loudly. The way a man says something when he has already made the decision and is simply informing the world of it. And I need you to come with me. I know, she said. She should have said something else. Something clinical. Something practical. That they needed a plan. That they needed Vesna. That they needed to understand what Aldric intended before they moved. All of that was true. Instead, she crossed the room and stood beside him, close enough that she could feel the cold that still lived in him from the unraveling. Present. Receding slightly, the way cold recedes when warmth has been consistent long enough, and she said, whatever reverses it, whatever the actual mechanism is, we will find it. Understood? He looked at her with dark eyes, that had been steady and controlled in a war room and a corridor and every difficult conversation she had watched him navigate, and that were something else right now. Something without the king's composure in it. Something quieter and more honest than that. He put his hand over hers, briefly, just for a moment, and she felt the anchor mark blaze warm against her collarbone in a way that was not subtle and not clinical, and that she was not, in that moment, even slightly interested in explaining away. "Understood," he said. Chapter 7. They found Aldric in the sorcerer's laboratory at the top of the North Tower. Not hiding, not fleeing, working, at the long stone bench where he did his best thinking, with a manuscript open before him and instruments arranged with the neatness of a man who had decided how everything would go and had set his space in order accordingly. He looked up when they came in, and his expression did not change into alarm or calculation or fear. It changed into relief. "Ah," he said, and set down his pen. "You found the archive." "Sit down," Caius said. Not raised, not cold. The voice of a man who expects to be obeyed and does not waste effort emphasizing it. Aldric sat. He folded his hands on the bench and looked at them both with the clear, steady eyes of a man who has been waiting for this room to arrive for some time. "The receipt," he said. "You'll want to know about that first." "I want to know why," Caius said. Aldric looked at his hands, then at Seren, then at Caius. "Do you know the name Arendelle?" Seren went still. That was her father's name. Her father, who had died 15 years ago when she was 20, 3 years into her healer training, taken by a fever that had spread through the lower city before anyone understood how to contain it. Her father, who had also been a healer. A talented one, her teachers had told her. Someone whose understanding of bloodcraft was decades ahead of the formal texts. "The anchor mark runs in your bloodline," Aldric said, looking at her steadily. "Arendelle was the last carrier, your father. When he died, the mark skipped a generation in dormant form. It would only manifest in his child under the right conditions." He paused. "Specifically, the death of a bonded partner. You killed Tobias," she said. Her voice came out flat and exact, the way it came out when she had no room left for anything except precision. "To activate my mark." "Yes," Aldric said. "Simply. And I arranged the Wraith Touch verdict because a carrier walking freely through the Empire could not be controlled. I needed to know where you were." "I needed to know you were safe." He said the last word as though it cost him something to say it beside everything else he'd already said. "You kept me in the pits for 8 months to protect me," she said. "I kept you there until I had everything I needed to bring you here without it looking like the deliberate extraction it was," he said. "If you had arrived under different circumstances, someone would have asked questions I couldn't answer yet." "The Unraveling," Caius said. "You placed it yourself." "Yes." Aldric turned to him, and now for the first time his composure became something more complicated. Not guilt exactly, but the expression of a man about to explain something he has been carrying for 5 years and has not spoken aloud because speaking it made it real. "You were going to sign the Accession Compact," he said. "The Northern Territories, the Eastern Border Alliance, the Drasvan Coalition, all of it simultaneously, at the Winter Council." "I remember," Caius said. "If you had signed." The Empire would have been bound into a 3-way political arrangement that Lord Casimir of the North had spent 4 years engineering specifically to position himself as the indispensable center of. Within 2 years, I calculated it and verified it with 3 separate advisors who didn't know they were answering the same question. Casimir would have had enough leverage to name himself co-sovereign. Within 5 years, he would have taken the Empire, Caius said. Piece by piece, legally, with your own name on the documents that enabled it. Aldric's voice was very quiet. I could not stop you from signing. I tried every channel available to me, and you had made your decision. You trusted Casimir. You believed the compact was in the Empire's interest. He looked at his hands. So I gave you a reason that had nothing to do with politics, to step back from the Winter Council. A condition that meant you could not attend, could not sign. Another pause. I did not intend for the Unraveling to progress this far. I placed it to be reversible. The reversal requires me. The laboratory was very still. You can reverse it, Seren said. I designed it to be reversible by the original caster, Aldric said. Yes, I can dissolve the anchor entirely. The gray will fade within weeks. There will be no lasting physical damage. He said this with the confidence of someone who had spent 5 years being certain about something. That was always the plan. Bring the carrier. Establish the genuine bond, because the mark, when active, produces an authentic resonance that acts as a conductor for the reversal craft. And when the bond was established, perform the dissolution. The bond, Caius said, in a tone that carried every implication of the word. Aldric looked between them. I studied your bloodline for 2 years before I chose your method, he said to Seren. I chose the anchor mark because its carrier, when a genuine bond forms, can conduct the dissolution craft without harm to either party. He looked at Caius. Whatever has developed between you in these 6 weeks is not something I manufactured. The mark creates the conditions. What you do within those conditions is your own. Caius was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice had the particular precision of a man who has decided that anger is a less useful tool than clarity. You killed a man to activate her. You imprisoned her for 8 months. You placed a curse in my blood without my knowledge or consent. You made decisions for this empire, for my life, that were not yours to make. He held Aldric's gaze with the full weight of 15 years of authority behind it. And you were not entirely wrong about Casimir. No, Aldric said. I wasn't. Which makes it worse, Caius said. Not better. Worse. Because I cannot dismiss you as simply malicious, and you know that. Aldric looked at him with the expression of a man who has indeed known that, and has been living with it for 5 years. Yes, he said. I know. Can you perform the dissolution tonight? Seren said. Both men looked at her. The unraveling is accelerating, she said. The episode 4 days ago was the worst yet. Every day we spend working through the ethics of what he did is a day the curse progresses further. Whatever he did, and I am not suggesting it was acceptable. I am not suggesting it should go unanswered. That answer requires him to be standing in a room with both of us, capable of performing a reversal. She looked at Aldric. Which means the reversal happens first. Aldric looked at Caius. Caius was looking at Seren. Something moved in his expression that had no public name, and that she felt land somewhere she was not entirely prepared for. Tonight, he said. Chapter 8. They cleared a room off the lower archive for it. Aldric worked for 2 hours preparing. Symbols drawn in ash and salt, a geometry Seren didn't fully understand but recognized as authentic from the oldest texts. The kind of preparation that could not be rushed without becoming useless. She spent those 2 hours beside him, watching, cross-referencing what he drew against what she had read, verifying each element with the thoroughness of a healer who was not, under any circumstances, going to let this man's calculations go unchecked. He permitted this, more than permitted. He welcomed it, with the openness of someone who had been operating in secret for 5 years, and found the scrutiny a relief. Vesna stood in the doorway with the expression of a woman who had known something was deeply wrong for 3 years, and was managing the confirmation of it by staying useful. At the 9th hour, Caius entered the room, and sat in the center of Aldric's prepared space. Seren knelt beside him. The work began. She placed her hand over the anchor point, the cluster of veins at his wrist where the unraveling had first taken root when the dissolution hit. He did not make a sound. That was the most extraordinary thing about it. A process this significant, this physically total, this reaching through a body that had been living with a curse for 5 years, produced from him only a sharp inhalation and a tightening of his jaw. His free hand found hers and held it, not asking for comfort, identifying a fixed point in a world that was rearranging itself. She held on. The anchor mark blazed. She felt the unraveling moving through the channel Aldric was creating. She felt it the way you feel cold water moving through a narrow passage, directed, controlled, being drawn out of the place it had lived for 5 years. It passed through her briefly, a sensation she would spend a long time trying to describe afterward and never quite manage. Something vast and cold and very old, pressing against the inside of her like a storm in a space too small to hold one. Then Aldric completed the sealing, the pressure released all at once, and the room went quiet. Caius exhaled. It was the most human sound she had ever heard him make. Not pain. The end of pain. The full-body release of something that had been braced for so long the bracing had become structural, had become part of how he held himself upright, and was now, suddenly, no longer necessary. He looked at his wrists. The gray was already retreating. Slowly. It would take days to clear fully. The body doesn't undo 5 years of damage in a single night. But it was receding. The cold that had lived in him like a second temperature was diminishing. She could feel it leaving by the way the air in the room changed. Aldric, across the circle, was gray with exhaustion. 5 years of carefully constructed craft unraveling in a single sustained effort had cost him. He sat back on his heels and did not try to stand. "It's done," he said, quietly. "The anchor is dissolved. The unraveling will clear within a fortnight." She looked at Caius. He was looking at his own hands with the expression of someone who has just rediscovered something they had spent a long time trying not to miss too much. "The court sorcerer placed a curse in my blood," he said, mostly to himself, and then spent 5 years building a mechanism to remove it. And the mechanism involved a condemned woman, and a mark that everyone misunderstood, and a dead man who should not have had to die for any of this. He looked up at her. "And somewhere in the middle of all of that—" "Don't," she said. "I'm going to," he said. "You're recovering from a bloodcraft dissolution. Then I'll be brief." He held her gaze with the dark, steady eyes that were already, she was not imagining it, warmer. The warmth that the unraveling had been consuming for years, running it like fuel, was returning to where it belonged. "Whatever you would have called this, before tonight. Whatever word you were using for what was happening in the archive every evening. I would like you to know that I have another word for it. And it is not gratitude." She looked at him for a long moment. "That is an extremely poorly timed speech," she said. "I am aware. You need rest." "I know. And Aldric needs to answer to the court for what he did. Tomorrow," he said. "Tonight I need you to sit here for another 10 minutes and not go anywhere." She sat. She didn't move. She was, she would admit to herself later, not even slightly tempted to move. The anchor mark pulsed warm and steady, and outside the lower archive, the keep went about the business of its early morning. And somewhere above them, Vesna was almost certainly making a list of everything that now needed to be managed, and none of it was required to be dealt with in the next 10 minutes. 10 minutes was a reasonable amount of time to simply be present. She was still there at 20 minutes. Neither of them mentioned it. She was the one who heard the knock. 3 beats on the door of the lower archive. Not Vesna's knock, not Aldric's, not the cadence of anyone she had learned in 6 weeks of living in this keep. She crossed to the door and opened it. The messenger was young, road dusty in the specific way of someone who had pushed hard through the night without stopping. He held a sealed letter in both hands, and when he saw her, his eyes went wide. Not with the ordinary surprise of finding the wrong person at a door, but with the alarmed recognition of someone who has been told exactly who to find. "Healer Dale," he said. "Not a question." "Yes," she said. He held the letter out with both hands, as though it were heavier than paper should be. She took it. The seal pressed into the wax was a crest she had seen before. Once, in a reference text on pre-imperial history, a chapter dealing with bloodlines that had been absorbed into the Empire's founding families 2 centuries ago. A crest that had, according to every record available, ceased to exist when its last bearer died without an heir in the year of the Empire's founding. She broke it carefully and unfolded the paper. The handwriting inside was not old, not copied. Fresh ink, a living hand. Someone who had written this recently and sent it in urgent haste. It read, "The anchor mark in your bloodline was not placed by accident. Your father understood what it was and what it was for, and he chose to carry it rather than pass it forward, until the choice was taken from him. The mark was never designed to cure a sovereign's curse. That was a use of convenience. It was designed for the thing that is coming. We have been watching the eastern border for 3 years. What moves there is not Casimir. Casimir is a distraction. What moves there does not have a human name. Whatever you do, do not let the mark go dormant again. And tell the sovereign, the second seal under the North Tower must not be opened under any circumstances. The second seal. He will know what it means. Tell him immediately. You have, perhaps 4 days." She read it twice. Then she turned. Caius was standing behind her. He had heard the knock, had followed, was close enough to read over her shoulder. She watched his face as he took in the letter, and felt him go still in a way that was entirely different from his usual controlled stillness. This was the stillness of a man who has heard a specific phrase, the second seal, and recognized it from somewhere he had not thought about in a very long time. "Caius," she said. "What is the second seal?" He looked at her, and what was in his eyes was not the exhaustion of a man recovering from a bloodcraft dissolution, not the grief of a man who had just learned his most trusted advisor had betrayed him for 5 years. It was something older than any of that, something that had been locked in the foundation of this keep since before the Empire had a name for itself. "There is a vault," he said slowly, "beneath the North Tower. My father told me about it when I was 12. He told me never to open it. He told me it held something that was sealed by the Empire's founders, something they had encountered and could not destroy, and so had contained instead." He looked at the letter. "He told me that if the seal was ever threatened, it would mean the thing inside had found a way to press against it from within." He stopped. The corridor was very cold. It had nothing to do with the unraveling. "He said," Caius continued, with the careful precision of a man quoting something memorized in childhood, "that if that day ever came, the only thing that had ever been able to hold it back was a bloodline with the anchor mark." The letter in Seren's hand was shaking slightly. She realized after a moment that it was because her hand was shaking. She locked it still. 4 days, she said. 4 days, he repeated. From somewhere far beneath them, far below the lower archive, far below the oldest stonework in the keep, from a depth that should have been nothing but bedrock and old foundation, came a sound. Not loud. Not dramatic. The kind of sound a thing makes when it has been waiting for a very long time and has just heard something that tells it the waiting is almost over. A sound like stone breathing. And then, in the silence that followed it, the anchor mark on Seren's collarbone blazed so hot she gasped. Not the warm, steady pulse of the past 6 weeks. Something immense. Something that felt less like a mark and more like a key recognizing the lock it was always meant for. Caius looked at her collarbone. She looked down. Just below the anchor mark, just below the 3 veins she had spent 8 months believing were her curse and 6 weeks learning were her inheritance, a second set of veins had appeared. New, dark, spreading in a different pattern, a different direction. Not the Unraveling, not Aldric's craft, not anything she had ever read in any text in any archive. Something that had been waiting inside her bloodline for 2 centuries. Something that had just woken up. The stone beneath them breathed again. And Seren Dale, who had survived the pits and the brand and the false verdict and the man who engineered her grief, who had learned in 6 weeks what she was capable of and who she might be willing to become, looked at Caius Varen and felt the full, terrible, exhilarating weight of a story that was not, in any sense, finished. "We need to go," she said. "I know," he said. Neither of them moved. The stone breathed a 3rd time, and this time the sound came with a word. Not spoken aloud, not exactly. The way a word arrives when it is very old and doesn't need air to travel. It said her name. Not Seren. The other name. The name from the letter. The name that had belonged to someone who died 200 years ago. Her name. A note for viewers. You think you know what just woke up under that tower. You don't. The second mark on Seren's collarbone has been in her bloodline since the Empire's founding, planted there deliberately by someone who knew exactly what was coming and needed someone to be ready when it arrived. Aldric knew about the anchor mark. He did not know about the second one. The founders didn't seal that vault to protect the Empire. They sealed it to protect what's times inside, times from the world. And what's inside has been waiting 200 years for someone with Seren's blood to stand close enough to hear it speak. 4 days. Part 2 comes next. You cannot afford to miss it.